My husband invited me to a business dinner with a critical French investor and told me to just sit there and look pretty. He thought the language barrier was his shield. He smiled at me across the candlelit table, held my hand, and then looked the investor in the eye and sold me out. He described exactly how he was going to leave me penniless, frame me for his massive corporate debt, and run off with his mistress. He did not know that while he was speaking French, I understood every single word. My name is Isabelle, 33 years old, and I never thought my marriage to a tech CEO would end over a plate of escargot and a conversation I was never supposed to understand. If you have ever been underestimated by the person who was supposed to love you most, please hit that like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. This is the story of how I turned his arrogance into my greatest weapon. Walking into Le Papillon that Tuesday evening felt less like a dinner date and more like walking onto a stage. The restaurant was one of those places in San Francisco where the menu had no prices and the air smelled like old money and silent judgment. Brandon, my husband of 5 years, and the CEO of NextGen, adjusted his bespoke suit and checked his reflection in the glass door. He looked the part of the successful Silicon Valley mogul perfectly. I was just the accessory on his arm there to soften his image. The maitre d' greeted us at the podium. Brandon immediately switched on his charm, responding in flawless, rapid-fire French. He laughed with the man clapping him on the shoulder, completely excluding me from the interaction. I stood there, maintaining the polite, vacant smile Brandon demanded I wear in public. He turned to me, his grip on my elbow tightening just enough to be painful. "Isabelle, try not to look so lost," he muttered in English, his voice dripping with condescension. "Just follow my lead and do not speak unless spoken to. Monsieur Dubois is old school. He does not want to hear your opinions on reality TV or whatever it is you do all day." I nodded, swallowing the sharp retort that rose in my throat. Brandon had spent the last 3 years convinced I was nothing more than a trophy wife who spent his money on yoga classes and brunch. He had conveniently forgotten that before I was Mrs. Brandon Hayes, I was a risk analyst for a top financial firm. He had forgotten a lot of things. We were led to a private corner table where Monsieur Dubois was already seated. He was a formidable man with silver hair and eyes that seemed to scan for weakness. Brandon practically shoved me into my chair before taking his own seat. "Monsieur Dubois, this is my wife Isabelle." Brandon introduced me in English, his tone dismissive. "She is a bit shy and frankly business bores her to tears, but she makes for excellent decoration, does she not?" Dubois looked at me, his gaze lingering for a moment too long. I saw a flicker of curiosity in his eyes, but Brandon cut it off by snapping his fingers for the waiter. "We will order for the table," Brandon announced, grabbing the menu before I could even touch it. I waited for him to ask me what I wanted, even though I knew he wouldn't. I had my eye on the sea bass, something simple and safe. "We will start with the foie gras, and for the main course my wife will have the hazelnut-crusted scallops," Brandon told the waiter with supreme confidence. My blood ran cold. I froze, staring at Brandon. He knew. He absolutely knew. "Brandon," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady, "I cannot eat that. The hazelnuts, I am allergic." He did not even look at me. He just smiled at Dubois and kicked my shin under the table, a sharp warning blow. "Do not make a scene, Isabelle," he hissed through his teeth, smiling fake warmth at the investor. "It is the chef's signature dish. You will eat it, or at least pretend to, so you do not insult our guest. Just pick the nuts off. Stop being so dramatic." I looked at the man I had married. He was willing to risk me going into anaphylactic shock just to impress a client. That was the moment the sadness finally evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard rage. I sat back, folded my hands in my lap, and decided to let him play his game. If he wanted to order my poison, I would let him serve it, but I would be the one writing the eulogy for his career. As the waiter retreated with our order, the atmosphere at the table shifted instantly. Brandon straightened his posture, cleared his throat, and looked directly at Monsieur Dubois. Then, without a glance in my direction, he switched languages. "So let us talk about serious things," Brandon said, his French accent surprisingly decent, though tainted with an arrogance that made my skin crawl. I reached for my water glass, my hand trembling slightly. Brandon had no idea. He had no idea that I spent 4 years in Lyon during my master's program. He had no idea that my mother was born in Marseille. To him, I was just the girl from Connecticut he met at a charity gala, the one he assumed had never ventured further than the Hamptons. Dubois leaned forward, his eyes flicking briefly to me before settling on my husband. "Are you sure we should discuss the merger here? With your wife present?" he asked in French, his voice low and gravelly. I braced myself. This was the moment a loving husband would say, "She is my partner. I trust her completely." Instead, Brandon laughed. It was a cold, dismissive sound. "Do not worry about Isabel," he replied, waving a hand in my direction as if shooing away a fly. "She is merely decorative. As long as she has a glass of wine and a shiny object to look at, she is happy. She does not have the capacity to understand high-level finance." The insult hit me like a physical slap. I forced the corners of my mouth to stay lifted, locking my jaw so tight my teeth ached. I stared at the candle flickering between us, focusing on the flame to keep from lunging across the table. Decorative, incapable. Dubois did not laugh. He studied me with an intensity that made me wonder if he suspected something. "She looks intelligent," he observed, taking a sip of his Bordeaux. "Are you certain she speaks no French?" "It would be awkward." Brandon leaned in, conspiring with the investor. "Look at her," he sneered in French. "She thinks we are complimenting her dress. She is a gold digger, Monsieur Dubois. A very expensive, very empty-headed liability. Once you sign the $50 million investment, I am filing for divorce. I just need her around to sign the liability waivers first." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Liability waivers. The papers he had left on the kitchen counter this morning. He had told me they were just routine insurance updates for the house. "Isabel," Brandon said sharply in English, snapping his fingers in front of my face. I blinked, snapping back to the present. "Yes, honey," I asked, pitching my voice to be as sweet and vacuous as he expected. "You are staring into space again," he scolded, shaking his head at Dubois as if to say, "See what I have to deal with. Try to look presentable. Monsieur Dubois was just admiring your necklace." Oh, I touched the diamond pendant at my throat, feigning delight. "Thank you, Monsieur Dubois. It was an anniversary gift." Brandon smirked at the investor. "See," he said in French, "rinse and repeat. Now about the restructuring of the debt." I took a long sip of icy water. He was planning to frame me. He was planning to destroy me. But he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had given the empty-headed wife the entire blueprint of his crime. Just as the waiter placed the foie gras on the table, the atmosphere shifted again. The heavy oak doors swung open and Camilla walked in. She was Brandon's executive assistant, technically speaking. But the way she moved through the restaurant suggested she managed much more than just his calendar. She was 10 years younger than me, wearing a sleek black dress that cost more than my first car, and her presence sucked the oxygen right out of the room. Brandon lit up. It was a visceral reaction, one I had not seen directed at me in years. He half rose from his chair, signaling the waiter to bring another setting before she even reached the table. "Sorry, I am late," she said, breathless and flushed. The traffic on the bridge was a nightmare. She did not apologize to me. She barely acknowledged I was there. She slid into the chair next to Brandon, reducing the space between them to mere inches. Her knee brushed against his under the table. I saw it. I felt the heat of their connection radiating across the white linen. "Camilla, you made it," Brandon said, his voice dropping an octave. "Monsieur Dubois. This is Camilla, my right hand at NextGen. She is the one who actually runs the show." Dubois nodded politely. "And this is my wife, Isabel," Brandon added as an afterthought. Camilla turned her gaze toward me. Her eyes were dark and sharp, like obsidian. "Oh, hi, Isabel," she said, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. "I did not know you were coming. I thought this was a strategy meeting." "I just came for the food," I said, forcing a self-deprecating laugh. "Brandon says the soufflé is to die for." Camilla turned back to Brandon and immediately switched to French. "She is even frumpier in person," she said, her voice smooth and melodic, masking the cruelty of her words. "What is she wearing? It looks like the upholstery on my grandmother's sofa." I froze. My hand hidden beneath the table gripped the tablecloth so hard my knuckles turned white. I felt my fingernails digging into my own palm, the sharp sting of crescent-shaped cuts grounding me. Do not react. Do not cry. Do not throw the wine in her face. Brandon laughed, a genuine, amused sound. I told you she has no taste, he replied in French, leaning in closer to her. She bought it at an outlet mall. She thinks it is vintage. It is pathetic, really. They shared a look that made my stomach churn. It was a look of shared secrets of intimacy that belonged to a marriage, not a boss and his assistant. I recognized her perfume now. It was the same floral scent that clung to Brandon's shirts when he came home late from late nights at the office. I sat there frozen in the spotlight of their humiliation, taking small, shallow breaths. To them, I was just a piece of furniture, deaf and dumb to their mockery. But inside, the risk analyst in me was waking up. I was no longer just a wife. I was an observer collecting data, and every insult they traded was another line of code in the program of their destruction. I took a sip of water, letting the cold liquid numb the lump in my throat. Let them laugh. Let them think I am the fool. It would only make the fall that much harder when I finally pulled the rug out from under them. The waiter poured the vintage Bordeaux, the dark red liquid swirling in the glass like blood. Brandon did not waste time. He leaned over the table, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, still speaking that crisp, confident French. The structure is simple, Monsieur Dubois. He explained, his eyes gleaming with greed. We move the toxic assets, the bad loans, the failed prototypes into a holding company. A holding company that, as of tomorrow morning, will be solely owned by my wife. Camila smirked, tracing the rim of her glass with a manicured finger. It is genius, really. We call it Project Scapegoat internally. By the time the auditors look at the books, NextGen will be clean ready for your $50 million investment and the debt that belongs to Isabel. She will file for bankruptcy within 6 months, and we will be drinking champagne in Saint-Tropez. I felt the blood drain from my face. The room seemed to tilt slightly. They were not just leaving me, they were not just cheating on me, they were planning to bury me. As a former risk analyst, I knew exactly what they were describing. It was a classic shell game, sophisticated fraud designed to offload millions in corporate losses onto an unsuspecting victim. And that victim was me. I looked down at my plate, forcing my hands to cut my steak into tiny, precise pieces. I had to focus on the mechanical action to keep from screaming. Cut, fork, chew, breathe. Dubois frowned, looking from Brandon to Camila. He swirled his wine thoughtfully, appearing unconvinced. Is that not incredibly risky? California is a community property state. If she hires a forensic accountant, if she gets a decent lawyer, she could drag this out for years. She could expose everything. He paused, looking at me again. And surely she reads what she signs. This is a massive transfer of liability. Even a layperson would ask questions. Brandon laughed, a sound that grated on my nerves like sandpaper. He took a sip of wine, looking at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. Monsieur Dubois, please. Look at her. Isabel thinks liability is a brand of perfume. He gestured vaguely in my direction with his fork. I put a stack of papers in front of her this morning before I left for the office. I told her they were insurance forms for her jewelry in the house. Do you know what she asked me? She asked if she needed to use a blue or black pen. She trusts me blindly. She is the perfect patsy. She will sign her life away tonight, and she will thank me for handling the paperwork. Camila giggled, leaning her head on Brandon's shoulder. She is so domestic, isn't she? It is almost sweet. I swallowed a piece of steak that tasted like ash. He was right about one thing. The papers were sitting on the kitchen counter next to the coffee machine. He expected me to sign them when we got home, but he was wrong about the rest. I had not signed them yet, and now that I knew what they really were, I was not just going to read them. I was going to rewrite them. The patsy they were mocking was about to become the architect of their ruin. The waiter cleared the appetizers, but the taste of bile remained in my throat. I thought I had reached the bottom of the well of betrayal, but Brandon was about to dig deeper. He poured himself more wine, his face flushed with the intoxication of his own perceived brilliance. He wanted to show Dubois just how committed he was to the family business, which apparently meant cleaning up his brother's messes at my expense. Terence, my brother. He has a bit of a gambling problem, Brandon said in French, waving his hand dismissively, as if discussing a minor accounting error. He got into deep water with some bad people last year. I needed $50,000 cash immediately, or they were going to break his legs. Dubois raised an eyebrow, swirling his glass. And you used company funds. That would be embezzlement, Brandon. No, do not worry. Brandon chuckled, a sound that made my skin crawl. I was smarter than that. I used Isabel's inheritance. Her mother left her a collection of vintage sapphires, beautiful pieces, museum quality. I stopped breathing. The air left my lungs in a rush. The burglary. 6 months ago, we had come home to find the back door smashed open, the safe empty. I had collapsed on the floor weeping for the loss of the only physical connection I had left to my late mother. Brandon had held me. He had rocked me back and forth on the kitchen floor, whispering that it would be okay, that they were just things, that at least we were safe. He continued speaking to Dubois, his voice brimming with pride for his own cunning. I staged the break-in myself, smashed the window, tossed the room to make it look authentic. I sold the gems to a private dealer in Macau the next day. She still cries about them sometimes. It is pathetic how sentimental she is over shiny rocks, but it saved Terrence's kneecaps. Dubois looked at me, and for a split second, his mask of indifference slipped. I saw genuine shock in his eyes. He looked back at Brandon. You stole from your wife and comforted her after. That is, remarkably cold. It was necessary, Brandon shrugged. Family comes first. And besides, she never wore them. They were gathering dust. Under the table, my hands uncurled. The trembling stopped. The fear stopped. The heartbreak that had been weighing on my chest for the last hour evaporated, replaced by a sensation I had never felt before. It was a cold, absolute clarity. He had watched me grieve. He had comforted me for a crime he committed. He had stolen my mother's memory to pay for his brother's poker habit. I picked up my wine glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. The sadness inside me calcified into something hard and sharp. I looked at the steak knife next to my plate. I did not want to stab him. That would be too quick. I wanted to dissect his life piece by piece until he was as empty as that safe. I wanted him to feel the exact helplessness I felt when I thought I had lost everything. Brandon thought he was a wolf among sheep, but he had just poked a sleeping dragon. And now the dragon was awake. I looked at Brandon, then at Camilla, then at the diamonds around my neck that had been bought with money stolen from my dead mother's legacy. The rage was a physical weight in my chest, hot and heavy, but I knew I could not explode yet. If I screamed now, I would just be the hysterical wife. I needed to be the surgeon who cuts out the tumor. I reached for my water glass, my movements deliberately jerky. I let my fingers fumble against the stem, and with a calculated shove, I tipped the crystal goblet over. Oh no! I cried out, shrinking back, as ice water flooded the pristine white tablecloth, soaking the edge of the breadbasket and dripping onto the floor. Brandon jumped back his chair, scraping loudly against the parquet floor. For God's sake, Isabel! He snapped in English, his face flushing with embarrassment. Can you not get through one meal without a disaster? I am so sorry, I stammered, grabbing my napkin and making a futile attempt to blot the spill, only making it worse. I think the wine. I think it went to my head. I feel terrible. Camilla rolled her eyes, making no effort to hide her annoyance as she checked her dress for splashes. Maybe you should just go home, Isabel, she suggested, her voice dripping with fake concern. You look pale. We can handle the rest of the business. Yes, Brandon agreed immediately, seizing the opportunity. Go home. Sleep it off. We have a lot of technical details to go over anyway. You would just be bored. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a single $20 bill. He thrust it into my hand, not caring that it would barely cover the booking fee, let alone the ride back to our house in the hills. Take an Uber, he ordered. I need the car to drive Monsieur Dubois back to his hotel. Do not wait up for me. I took the crumpled bill. It was the final insult. My husband, the multimillionaire CEO, was dismissing me with pocket change like I was a hired help he was firing mid-shift. I am sorry to ruin the night, Monsieur Dubois, I said, looking the investor in the eye one last time. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Rest well, madame. I turned my back on the table. I heard Brandon immediately switch back to French, apologizing for my clumsiness, calling me a clumsy child. The sound of their laughter followed me as I threaded my way through the crowded dining room. I kept my head down, shoulders hunched, playing the part of the shamed wife until I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the cool San Francisco night. The valet stepped forward, but I waved him away. As the heavy door clicked shut behind me, muffling the sounds of the restaurant, a transformation took place. I straightened my spine. The vacuous, apologetic smile vanished from my face, replaced by a look of stone-cold determination. I looked at the $20 bill in my hand and crumpled it into a tight ball, dropping it into the nearest trash can. Brandon thought he had just sent his foolish wife home to cry into her pillow. He thought he had cleared the board so he could play his game. He was wrong. He had just sent me to my war room. The crying was done. The war had just begun. The morning sun did not bring clarity. It brought Terrence. I was in the kitchen staring into the black depths of my coffee mug, counting the minutes until the banks opened when the front door slammed open against the wall. He did not knock. He never knocked. Brandon had given his younger brother a key 3 years ago, claiming it was for emergencies. The only emergency Terrence ever seemed to have was a lack of free food and an abundance of gambling debts. Terrence stomped into the kitchen, bringing a gust of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cologne with him. He was the chief financial officer of NextGen, a title that looked impressive on LinkedIn, but meant absolutely nothing in practice. In reality, he was Brandon's bagman, the one who moved the numbers around to hide the rot. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a designer tracksuit that cost more than my first car, but he wore it with the desperate energy of a man who knows his knees are about to be broken by a loan shark. "Yo, Isabel," he grunted, ignoring my greeting. He walked straight to the refrigerator and yanked it open, staring at the contents with open disgust. "Where is the real food?" he snapped, grabbing a carton of organic orange juice and drinking directly from the spout, liquid dribbling down his chin. "There is nothing in here but rabbit food, kale, spinach, almond milk. Does my brother starve you, or are you just too lazy to go to the grocery store?" "I am sorry, Terrence," I said, keeping my voice soft and airy, the perfect picture of the submissive sister-in-law. "I was planning to go to the market later today. I did not know you were coming over so early." He slammed the carton back onto the shelf, rattling the glass jars. "You have one job, Isabel. One job. Stay home, look pretty, and keep the fridge stocked. You do not work. You do not have kids. You literally have nothing else to do with your life. How hard is it to buy some ham and cheese?" He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes scanning the kitchen with a manic intensity. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes and a slight tremor in his hands that had nothing to do with caffeine. I knew that look. It was the look of a man who was deep in the hole. "Brandon told me about the dinner last night," he said, leaning against the counter and crossing his arms. "He said you embarrassed him, spilled water all over the table like a clumsy toddler." "It was an accident," I murmured, looking down at my hands. Terrence scoffed. "You are a liability. You know that Brandon is out there trying to build an empire, trying to secure our future, and you are just existing. A dead weight. Honestly, I do not know why he keeps you around. If it were up to me, I would have cut you loose years ago." I gripped my coffee mug tighter. "If it were up to you, I thought this house would have been foreclosed on last year to pay off your poker debts in Vegas." I knew about the company credit cards he had maxed out. I knew about the consulting fees he paid to shell companies that led directly to his personal offshore accounts. "Is Brandon up?" Terrence demanded, pushing off the counter. "We have work to do. Real work. Not whatever it is you do." "He is in the shower," I said. "Good. Make yourself useful and make me a sandwich. And try not to burn the house down while you're at it." He brushed past me, deliberately bumping my shoulder hard enough to make me stumble, and headed toward the living room. He pulled out his phone, and I heard him hissing into the receiver as he walked away. "I need more time, man. The deal closes today. I swear I will have the cash by tonight. Just tell him to back off." I stood in the kitchen listening to the panic in his voice. He was not just a rude in-law. He was a desperate animal backed into a corner. And desperate animals were careless. He thought I was just the maid who made sandwiches. He did not realize I was the one holding the match that was about to burn his entire world to the ground. 10 minutes later, I was on the living room floor, curled into a child's pose on my yoga mat. My large, noise-canceling headphones were securely over my ears. To anyone watching, I was a housewife, finding her center listening to ocean sounds or a guided meditation. In reality, the volume was turned all the way down to zero. I was a surveillance unit in Lululemon leggings. Brandon and Terrence walked into the room. I felt the vibration of their heavy footsteps through the floorboards before I heard them. They stopped just a few feet away from where I lay. "She can hear us!" Terrence whispered, his voice tense. "She is listening to whale songs." Brandon scoffed, the sound of ice hitting a glass echoing in the room. He was already drinking again. "You could set off a bomb next to her when she is in the zone, and she would not flinch." Relax. I focused on regulating my breathing, keeping my back rhythmically rising and falling while my ears strained to catch every syllable. "I cannot relax, Brandon." Terrence hissed, his voice rising in panic. "The loan sharks gave me until Friday. That is 48 hours. If that transfer does not go through, if she does not take the debt, they are going to come for me. And once they are done with me, they are coming for you." "I handle Isabel, Brandon," said his voice smooth and arrogant. "I told you the papers are on the counter. She thinks it is just routine insurance updates. She will sign them before lunch." "She better," Terrence growled. The sound of his pacing was frantic back and forth on the hardwood floor. "You are too soft with her. You play these long games. We do not have time for games anymore." "I am not being soft, I am being smart," Brandon retorted. "If I push too hard, she might actually read the fine print. And if she reads that she is assuming liability for $5 million in corporate debt, even she might hesitate. I have to massage the situation." I pressed my forehead harder into the yoga mat. $5 million. The number made my stomach turn. They were not just trying to bankrupt me, they were trying to bury me under a mountain of debt that would take 3 lifetimes to pay off. "Well, massage faster," Terrence snapped. "Because I am telling you right now, brother, I am not going to jail, and I am not getting my legs broken for your company. If she hesitates, if she asks one single question about those papers, we go to Plan B." There was a silence. A heavy, terrifying silence. "What is Plan B?" Brandon asked, his voice lower. Terrence laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "She drives that old sedan to the market every Tuesday, right? Those mountain roads are tricky. Brakes fail all the time. It would be a tragedy, sure, but a widow with a hefty life insurance policy solves our debt problem just as well as a bankrupt ex-wife." My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was terrified they could see my shirt moving. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. This was no longer just about money. This was about survival. Terrence was not just a desperate gambler. He was a cornered animal willing to kill. And Brandon did not say no. He did not defend me. He just took another sip of his drink. "Do not be an idiot," Brandon finally said, but there was no horror in his voice, only annoyance. "Just let me get the signature. It is cleaner." I stayed on the mat for another 20 minutes after they left the room, shaking uncontrollably. I was not doing yoga. I was mourning the last shred of my denial. My husband was not just a thief. He was an accomplice to murder. I slowly sat up and took off the headphones. The time for gathering information was over. It was time to hunt. As soon as the front door clicked shut and the roar of Brandon's Porsche faded down the driveway, the trembling stopped. It was not fear anymore. It was adrenaline. I stood up from the yoga mat, peeled off the leggings that were part of my costume, and walked straight to the back of the house. I stopped in front of the door to the small guest room. For the last 3 years, Brandon had referred to this as the storage closet. He filled it with his old golf clubs, broken printers, and boxes of tax returns he never looked at. He thought he had buried my past in here beneath layers of domestic debris. He was wrong. I pushed aside a stack of dusty cardboard boxes and knelt on the floorboards. I reached behind the heavy filing cabinet, my fingers brushing against the cool metal of a loose floor vent. I pried it open. Inside, wrapped in an anti-static bag, was my lifeline. My old laptop. It was a custom-built machine stripped of any tracking software, air-gapped from the rest of the house's network until I needed it. I sat on the floor surrounded by the junk of my marriage and flipped the lid open. The screen flared to life. No family photos as a background, just a black screen and a blinking green cursor. My fingers flew across the keyboard, muscle memory taking over instantly. The command prompt window opened and I typed in the decryption key. Brandon liked to tell his friends he rescued me from a boring job in administration. That was the lie we agreed on to soothe his fragile ego. The truth was sharper. Before I was Mrs. Isabel Hayes, the woman who spent too much time arranging flowers. I was a senior quantitative risk analyst for a top-tier Wall Street hedge fund. My job was not administration. My job was predicting disasters. I built algorithms that could spot a fraudulent asset or a market crash 3 weeks before it made the news. They used to call me the canary in the coal mine. I had retired early because I fell in love, or thought I had. I traded the high-stress trading floor for a quiet life in the suburbs thinking I was building a partnership. Instead, I had just acquired the most volatile asset of my career. I connected the laptop to the encrypted hotspot on my burner phone. The screen filled with lines of cascading code as I initiated the handshake protocol with the outside world. Brandon thought he was the smart one because he could speak French and hide money in shell companies. But he had forgotten the first rule of risk management: never underestimate the auditor. I was not just looking for a way out. I was looking for the digital trail that would lead him straight to a federal prison cell. And I knew exactly where to start digging. The glow of the monitor was the only light in the dusty room, reflecting off my glasses as I initiated the handshake protocol. Brandon had always bragged about NextGen's military-grade security, boasting that their firewall was impenetrable. What he failed to mention, or perhaps what he was simply too ignorant to understand, was that I was the one who built the architecture 5 years ago. He had been too cheap to hire a new CTO to update the core code, assuming that the initial framework would hold forever. That arrogance was his fatal error. I did not need to hack the system. I just needed to use the master key I had embedded in the kernel for maintenance, a backdoor he never knew existed. My fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard. Access granted. The command prompt flashed green, and suddenly I was inside the beast. I bypassed the user interface and went straight for the raw data, pulling up the SQL databases that house the company's true financial heart. On the surface, everything looked pristine. The folders prepared for Monsieur Dubois were filled with projected growth charts and inflated user acquisition numbers. They painted a picture of a Silicon Valley unicorn ready to soar. But I was not here for the marketing material. I navigated to the accounts payable ledger and cross-referenced it with the bank API. The discrepancy was immediate and nauseating. The revenue columns were padded with projected income from contracts that had not been signed yet. Phantom money. But the debt columns, those were terrifyingly real. NextGen was not just in the red. It was hemorrhaging cash. The $5 million debt Brandon had mentioned at dinner was a lie. It was closer to $12 million. I ran a specific query for recent outflows, filtering for anything labeled consulting or external vendor. The screen populated with hundreds of transactions. My eyes narrowed as I spotted a recurring transfer to an entity called Titanium Holdings, LLC. $50,000 a week. Every week. For the last 18 months. I traced the routing number. It did not go to a software vendor in India or a server farm in Oregon. It routed through a series of shell accounts before landing in a private crypto exchange wallet registered in Nevada. Terrence. It was sloppy. It was the kind of embezzlement a desperate gambling addict commits when he thinks no one is watching. Terrence was not just managing the finances, he was siphoning the company's lifeblood to pay off his bookies, and Brandon and I pulled up his executive emails. He was CC'd on the alerts. He knew. He allowed it. He was letting his brother bleed the company dry, and now they needed a fresh body to pin the murder on. I sat back, the cold light of the screen illuminating the truth. They were not just bad businessmen, they were criminals. If I signed those papers, I would not just be liable for the debt. I would be liable for the fraud. I would be the one going to federal prison for embezzlement while they vanished. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a flash drive. I plugged it in and initiated a full mirror download of the server. Every email, every ledger, every damning transaction. The progress bar crawled across the screen. 10%, 20%. Let them have their mimosa brunch. Let them think I am doing yoga. I was currently downloading the nail for their coffins. I watched the percentage climb, feeling a grim satisfaction. They wanted to give me the company fine. I would take it. I would take the evidence, I would take the truth, and I would take them down. The financial fraud was enough to put him behind bars for a decade, but I was not done. I needed to know everything. I kept scrolling through his archived emails, bypassing the threads with his bookie and the hotel receipts for his weekends with Camila. I found a folder buried deep in the directory labeled Simply Supplements. I clicked it open, expecting to find invoices for the protein powder he obsessively ordered. Instead, I found a chain of emails with an offshore pharmacy based in Mexico. The subject line read, Recurring Order Number 4492, Desogestrel High Potency. I froze. I knew that drug. I was a risk analyst. I researched everything. That was a synthetic progestogen, a contraceptive. I opened the latest thread. It was a conversation between Brandon and his college friend Dave, who was now a pharmacist. Is the dosage high enough? Brandon had written on June 12th. She said she felt nauseous last week and I got worried. I cannot risk a parasite right now. A parasite? That was what he called our potential child. Dave's reply was casual, sickeningly bro-like. Relax, man. Just double the dose in the morning. Crush it into a fine powder. As long as she drinks that green sludge every day, her ovaries are shut down tight. She is as barren as a desert. I stopped breathing. The green sludge. I slowly turned my head to look at the desk behind me. Sitting there, sweating condensation onto a leather coaster, was the tall glass of kale and spinach smoothie Brandon had prepared for me before he left. He made it for me every single morning. He called it his act of service. He would stand over me smiling that charming, supportive smile, watching me drink every drop. It is for your fertility, babe, he would say, packed with folic acid. It will help heal whatever is wrong with you. The memories crashed into me like a freight train. The 3 years of negative pregnancy tests. The humiliation of sitting in fertility clinics while doctors told me there was no medical explanation for my condition. The way Brandon would sigh in the car ride home, looking at me with disappointed eyes, telling me he loved me, despite my defect. The way his mother would pat my hand at Thanksgiving and say, Some women just aren't built to be mothers, dear. Maybe it is for the best. He had not just stolen my money. He had not just stolen my time. He had violated my body. He had medically assaulted me every single morning for 3 years. He had watched me cry over negative tests that he had engineered. He had let me believe I was broken when he was the one poisoning me. I stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, but I did not hear it. I walked over to the desk and picked up the glass. The green liquid looked innocent. It smelled like spinach and betrayal. I walked to the kitchen. I did not run. I did not scream. I felt a cold, terrifying calm settle over me. I stood in front of the deep farmhouse sink. I looked at the liquid that represented 3 years of gaslighting. I did not pour it down the drain. I raised the heavy glass and slammed it into the porcelain basin with every ounce of strength I possessed. The sound was explosive. Shards of glass flew everywhere, mixing with the thick green liquid, splattering across the white backsplash like toxic blood. A jagged piece of glass sliced my finger, but I did not feel the pain. I stared at the mess. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was for the woman who wanted a family with a monster. That woman died the moment she read that email. The woman standing in the kitchen now wanted nothing but total scorched earth destruction. Dinner that night was a masterclass in hypocrisy. I sat at the head of the table watching the 3 people who were actively plotting my destruction eat the roast chicken I had prepared. I had swept up the shards of the smoothie glass and bandaged my finger, burying the rage under a layer of ice-cold composure. Brandon sat to my right, pouring a 3rd glass of wine for Camilla, who was seated brazenly on his left. Terrence was across from me, tearing into his food with the manners of a starving wolf. The conversation naturally drifted to the future, their future. They spoke about the $50 million investment as if it were already in the bank, discussing vacation homes in Aspen and new cars. I ate in silence, dissecting my food with surgical precision, listening to them carve up the carcass of a company they had already killed. "It is a shame, really," Terence said, waving a chicken leg bone in the air to emphasize his point. "This house is huge. 4 bedrooms, a pool, and it is just so quiet. Brandon needs a legacy, you know. A son to take over the empire one day." Camilla giggled, leaning her head on Brandon's shoulder, her eyes flicking to me with malicious pity. "Well, not everyone is built for motherhood, Terence. Biology can be cruel. I heard that after 30 the odds drop off a cliff. Maybe it is for the best. A baby would ruin Isabel's yoga schedule." Brandon laughed. It was the same laugh he used when he watched sitcoms, detached and amused. "We tried, believe me," he said, reaching out to stroke Camilla's arm right in front of me. "God knows we tried. But you cannot force nature. Some fields are just barren. It is a tragedy, but I have made my peace with it. I will just have to leave my legacy elsewhere." He winked at Camilla. The implication was nauseatingly clear. He was already planning a new family with her, using the money he planned to steal from me. The old Isabel would have excused herself to cry in the bathroom. The old Isabel would have internalized the shame, wondering what was wrong with her body. But the woman sitting at the table tonight knew exactly what was wrong. It was not her body. It was the poison in the morning smoothie. I set down my fork. The clatter of silver against china rang out in the room like a gunshot. I picked up my wine glass, swirling the red liquid, staring directly at my husband. "Actually, Brandon," I said, my voice steady and dangerously low. The table went quiet. They were not used to me speaking up. "I was reading an agricultural journal today." I continued, keeping my eyes locked on his. It was fascinating. It turns out that when a crop fails to grow for 3 years in a row despite perfect conditions and constant care, it is almost never the fault of the soil. The experts say that usually nothing grows because the seed itself is rotten to the core. The silence that followed was absolute. Camilla's smile froze. Terence stopped chewing. Brandon looked at me, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He opened his mouth to speak, to yell, to put me back in my place, but the truth hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. I took a sip of my wine, savoring the bouquet. For the first time in years, the dinner tasted delicious. I had not just defended myself, I had fired the first warning shot. And from the look in Brandon's eyes, he knew he had just been hit. I excused myself from the table, claiming I needed to check on dessert. It was a lie. I needed to get away from the suffocating stench of their hypocrisy before I grabbed a steak knife and did something that would send me to prison instead of them. I walked down the long, dimly lit hallway toward the kitchen, my heels clicking softly on the hardwood. I was halfway there when a shadow detached itself from the doorway of the study and stepped into my path. It was Terence. He moved with a speed that defied his size, slamming a heavy hand against the wall right next to my head. The sound cracked through the silence like a gunshot. I flinched, my back pressing against the floral wallpaper. He leaned in close, invading my personal space until all I could smell was stale bourbon and the metallic tang of aggression. "Going somewhere, sister-in-law?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in my chest. "You were very chatty at dinner. Very poetic, rotten seeds and all that. Since when do you have opinions on agriculture?" I swallowed hard, forcing my heart rate to slow down. Panic was a variable I could not afford. "I just read an article, Terence," I said, keeping my voice small and trembling, playing the part he expected. "I was just making conversation." He laughed, but it did not reach his eyes. His eyes were cold, dead things, like a shark sensing blood in the water. "You are acting different, Isabel." "I do not like different. Different makes me nervous, and when I get nervous, I get clumsy." He took a step closer, pinning me with his body weight without actually touching me. He lowered his head until his mouth was inches from my ear. "You know this is a big old house," he whispered, his hot breath ghosting over my skin. "Lots of steep stairs, lots of slippery floors. It would be so easy for someone to take a tumble. A tragic accident. That is what the police would call it. Just a clumsy housewife who lost her footing." I stopped breathing. This was not a vague warning. This was a promise. He was letting me know that Plan B was not just a theoretical conversation I had overheard, it was an active option. He pulled back slightly, looking at me with a sneer. So here is some advice from your favorite brother-in-law. Sign the papers Brandon gave you. Do it tonight. Be the good, obedient little wife we all know you are. Because if you keep opening your mouth, if you keep making smart comments, accidents will happen. And I would hate for Brandon to become a widower so young. He tapped my cheek twice with his finger. It was a humiliating, patronizing gesture. Then he pushed off the wall and walked back toward the dining room, whistling a low, tuneless melody. I stood there in the hallway, my legs shaking. He thought he had terrified me into submission. He thought the threat of violence would send me running back to my place in the corner. He was wrong. I touched the spot on my cheek where he had tapped me. He had just confirmed everything. They were desperate. They were terrified. And most importantly, they were sloppy. A man who threatens a woman in her own home is a man who has run out of intelligent moves. I straightened my dress and smoothed my hair. He wanted an accident, I would give him one. But it would not be me falling down the stairs. It would be their entire house of cards coming down on top of their heads. I waited until the front door slammed shut, signaling Terrence's departure. The silence that filled the house was not peaceful. It was the heavy, charged silence of a battlefield before the first mortar is fired. I did not go to my bedroom to cry. I did not call my mother. I returned to the guest room, locked the door, and slid the heavy dresser in front of it. Not for safety, but for total operational security. I pulled the burner phone from its hiding place inside an old, hollowed-out textbook. I dialed a number I had memorized 6 years ago, a number that belonged to a life Brandon thought I had left behind. It rang twice. Special Agent Miller. A gruff voice answered. "Hello, David," I said, my voice stripping away the soft, submissive cadence of the housewife and returning to the sharp, clipped tone of a senior analyst. "It is Isabel. The canary is singing." There was a pause followed by the sound of a chair shifting. Isabel. I have not heard that code name since the Lehman collapse. I thought you retired to the suburbs to bake cookies. I did, I replied, staring at the lines of code still scrolling on my laptop screen. But it turns out my husband is running a Ponzi scheme disguised as a tech startup, and his brother is laundering money through a shell company in Nevada called Titanium Holdings. I have the server, mirror the bank transfers, and the falsified ledgers. I am sending you the encrypted packet now. I hit the enter key. The upload bar surged forward. I heard David typing furiously on the other end. Titanium Holdings. We have been tracking that wallet for months. We just could not link it to a domestic entity. You are telling me it is next-gen. It is next-gen, I confirmed. They are cooking the books to secure a $50 million investment from a French angel investor named Dubois. The signing is tomorrow morning. They plan to transfer the debt to me, divorce me, and flee the country. David let out a low whistle. That is wire fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and attempted grand larceny. That is a RICO case, Isabel. We can pick them up right now. No, I said, my eyes narrowing. Not yet. If you pick them up now, they will claim it was an accounting error. They will blame a junior employee. They will wiggle out of it. You know how these guys operate. I want them dead to rights, David. I want them caught in the act. David hesitated. What are you suggesting? I'm going to let the meeting proceed? I said, my voice cold. I will be there. I will let Brandon present the fraudulent documents to Dubois. I will let him attempt to execute the signature. Once he puts pen to paper to defraud an international investor, it is no longer a conspiracy. It is a federal crime in progress. I want you in the room next door. It is dangerous, Isabel, David warned. If they figure out you are the mole, they won't. I cut him off. They think I am a moron who drinks kale smoothies and watches reality TV. They think I am the perfect victim. Let's show them exactly how dangerous a victim can be. David laughed, a short, sharp bark of approval. All right. I will have a team at the next-gen offices by 8 a.m. We will be listening. Do not take any risks, Isabel. I hung up the phone and looked at the stack of insurance papers Brandon had left on the desk. I picked up a pen. I was not going to sign them, of course, but I was going to make sure they looked ready. I was setting the stage for the final act. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The fear of Terrence, the heartbreak over Brandon, it was all gone. All that was left was the mission, and I had never failed a mission in my life. The rain in San Francisco was falling in sheets, washing away the city grime, but unable to touch the rot inside my marriage. I pulled my trench coat tighter and ducked into the back of the dimly lit cafe. It was a place for students and poets far from the polished marble lobbies of the financial district where Brandon held court. Veronica was already there, sitting in a corner booth, shielding her eyes with dark sunglasses. She was not just my college roommate. She was the most ruthless divorce attorney in the Bay Area. She was the only person on earth who knew where the bodies were buried, because she had helped me dig the graves for my old life. "Isabel," she said, sliding a hot coffee across the scratched wooden table. "You look like you are ready to kill someone." Not someone, I corrected, sitting down and checking the room for surveillance. "A career, a reputation, maybe a legacy." I slid the encrypted flash drive and the stack of printed emails across the table. Veronica picked them up, her professional demeanor instantly replacing the concerned friend. She scanned the pages, her frown deepening with every line. She stopped at the draft of the document Brandon wanted me to sign. "This is diabolical," she murmured, tapping a manicured nail on the paper. "Do you understand what this is? California is a community property state. That means legally, you and Brandon are a single financial entity. His debt is your debt, his fraud is your fraud. If the ship goes down, you both drown." I nodded. "I know. That is why he wants me to sign this." "Exactly." Veronica continued, her voice sharp. "This is a transmutation agreement disguised as a waiver. If you sign this, you are agreeing to take his business debts, the $12 million, the loans from the sharks, the embezzled funds, and reclassify them as your sole and separate obligation. He is not just divorcing you, Isabel. He is turning you into a human shield. He walks away with the assets and the French investment. You walk away with a bankruptcy filing and a potential prison sentence for his tax evasion." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, despite the warmth of the coffee. Hearing it laid out in legal terms made it real. It was premeditated murder of my future. "So, how do we stop it?" I asked. "We have two options," Veronica said, pulling a legal pad from her bag. "Option 1. We file for an emergency injunction right now. We show this evidence to a judge. We freeze the accounts. It is safe, it is standard, and it will tie you up in court for 3 years." I shook my head immediately. Number 3 years gives him time to hide the money in crypto. It gives Terrence time to disappear. I need option 2. "Option 2 is the innocent spouse relief defense," Veronica said, looking me dead in the eye. "But for that to work, you need to prove he actively deceived you. You need to prove duress. And the best way to do that is to let him try to execute the crime." I leaned forward. "The meeting with Monsieur Dubois is tomorrow morning. He expects me to sign this document in front of them to prove the company is stable." "Then you have to go," Veronica said. "You have to walk into that room. You have to let him hand you the pen. You have to let him dig his own grave in front of a witness. But we need a safeguard." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a document holder. "I drafted this while you were driving over. It is a counter affidavit. It states that any signature you provide under duress is void, and it lays out the timeline of his fraud. We will file this with the court registrar electronically at 8:59 a.m. 1 minute before your meeting starts. When he hands you that pen, he will think he is winning. In reality, he will be signing a confession." I took the document. It felt heavy like a weapon. "One more thing," Veronica added, her eyes softening. "Once this starts, there is no going back. You are going to destroy him, Isabel. You are going to strip him of his company, his money, and his freedom. Are you sure you are ready to be the villain in his story?" I thought about the green smoothie. I thought about the 3 years of tears. I thought about the diamonds he stole from my mother. "I am not the villain, Veronica," I said, standing up. "I am just the auditor. And the audit is overdue." My hands were steady. The shaking that had plagued me yesterday was gone, replaced by the cold mechanical precision of a woman executing a trade. I pulled up the contact number from Monsieur Dubois's private line, a number I had extracted from Brandon's synchronized contacts during the hack. I took a deep breath, closing my eyes for a second to center myself. When I opened them, Isabelle the housewife was gone. Isabelle the Sorbonne-educated analyst was in the driver's seat. I hit dial. It rang 3 times before a gruff, irritated voice answered. "Hello? Who is this? I do not recognize this number." I spoke, and the transformation was complete. I did not use English. I switched to French, but not just any French. I adopted the crisp, authoritative cadence of the Parisian financial elite, the kind of accent that implies old money and expensive education. "Monsieur Dubois, do not hang up," I said, my voice low and urgent. "Unless you want to lose $50 million tomorrow morning." There was a pause on the other end. The irritation was replaced by a sharp, attentive silence. "Who is this? You can call me a concerned third party," I replied, staring at the raindrops racing down the glass. "I have just sent an encrypted email to your secure server. Subject line, Titanium Holdings." "Titanium Holdings." He repeated the name, rolling off his tongue with confusion. "I do not know that name." "You will," I said. "It is the shell company where Brandon Hayes is funneling the capital from NextGen. The balance sheets you saw at dinner. They are fairy tales, Monsieur Dubois. The growth charts are fabricated. The user base is inflated by bots. And the only real cash flow is the money leaving the company to pay off gambling debts in Nevada." I heard the sound of typing in the background. He was checking his email. "This is preposterous," Dubois muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Brandon is a visionary. I have seen the audits." "You saw the audits Brandon paid for," I corrected him. "Open the attachment I just sent you. It contains the raw server logs from the last 6 months. It shows the wire transfers. It shows the doctoring of the quarterly reports." A long, heavy silence stretched between us. I knew exactly what he was looking at. I had sent him the smoking gun, but I had withheld the bullets. I sent him enough to prove fraud, but not enough to explain how it was done or who was helping him. I needed him curious. I needed him angry. But most importantly, I needed him to show up at that meeting. This is alarming," Dubois finally said, his voice cold. "Who are you? A disgruntled employee? A rival?" "I am the person giving you a chance to catch a thief," I said. "But listen to me carefully. Do not cancel the meeting. If you confront him now over the phone, he will destroy the evidence. He will blame a glitch. He will run. You need to catch him in the act." "What are you suggesting?" he asked. "Go to the meeting tomorrow. Let him present the papers. Let him ask for the signature. When he tries to close the deal based on these lies, that is when you have him. That is when it becomes federal fraud. Why are you helping me?" Dubois asked, suspicion creeping back into his tone. "Because I hate a bad investment, Monsieur Dubois," I said. "I will see you tomorrow." I hung up before he could ask another question. I pulled the SIM card out of the phone and snapped it in half, dropping the pieces into my empty coffee cup. The bait was in the water. The shark had taken a bite. Now all I had to do was wait for Brandon to reel himself in. I put the car in gear and drove home to play the part of the loving, oblivious wife one last time. The heavy oak front door clicked open and Brandon walked in. He was wearing his deal-closing face, a tight, practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, masked by a layer of feigned exhaustion. He carried a bouquet of white lilies in one hand and a thick leather portfolio in the other. He tossed the flowers onto the kitchen island with a little too much force, the petals shuddering against the granite. "Hey, babe," he said, his voice dripping with a synthetic sweetness that set my teeth on edge. "Sorry I'm late. The lawyers are being absolute vultures today. You know how it is." He didn't wait for a response. He unzipped the portfolio and slid a heavy stack of documents across the counter toward me. The paper made a dry, rasping sound against the stone. "I need a huge favor," he said, loosening his tie as he walked to the fridge to pour himself a drink. "The insurance adjusters are losing their minds over the merger. Apparently, with the new valuation of the company, our personal liability premiums are skyrocketing. They need us to sign these updated waivers tonight, or the whole deal with Dubois could stall tomorrow morning." I looked at the stack. It was impressive. He had gone to great lengths to make it look legitimate. The cover page bore the logo of a major insurance firm, a logo I knew he had downloaded from Google Images. He had flagged the signature pages with cheerful yellow sticky notes, ensuring I wouldn't have to flip through the actual text. "Just sign where the tabs are," he instructed, pressing his expensive Mont Blanc pen into my hand. "It is standard boilerplate stuff. Fire, theft, flood. I already read through it twice. It is boring but necessary." I looked down at the page he had opened for me. The font was small, dense, and deliberately difficult to read. He thought I saw insurance waivers. I saw a death sentence. I knew exactly what was written under those sticky notes because I had read the drafts on his server. This wasn't insurance. It was a transmutation agreement. Clause 4 Section B stated that I, Isabel Hayes, voluntarily assumed full responsibility for all outstanding debts of next-gen technologies totaling $12 million. Clause 7 was a post-nuptial waiver, in which I agreed to forfeit all claims to marital assets including the house in the event of a divorce. He wasn't just asking me to sign a paper. He was asking me to sign my own execution order. He was asking me to agree to be homeless, bankrupt, and liable for his crimes, all while promising me he was protecting our future. "I trust you, Brandon," I said softly, looking up at him. "You always handle the hard stuff." He smiled, and for a second, I saw the relief wash over him. He thought he had won. He thought the stupid little wife was buying the lie, hook, line, and sinker. "Exactly," he said, coming around the counter to massage my shoulders. His hands felt heavy and cold, like a predator testing the weight of its prey. "I do this for us, Isabel. I build the empire, you keep the home fires burning. We are a team. Now just put your autograph right there, and tomorrow morning we will be $50 million richer. We can finally take that trip to Napa you wanted." Napa. He was offering me a weekend of wine tasting while actively stealing my life. I gripped the pen. My knuckles turned white, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of not stabbing it into his hand. I leaned over the document, the tip of the pen hovering over the dotted line. I could feel his breath on my neck, eager, greedy, impatient. "Okay," I whispered. "Let's secure our future." I hovered the tip of the pen over the signature line, letting my hand tremble just enough to sell the performance. I squinted at the dense blocks of text biting my lower lip in a display of confusion that I knew Brandon would interpret as stupidity. "Honey," I said, my voice rising in a pitch of anxious uncertainty. "I do not understand some of these words. What does unilateral indemnification mean? And here where it says irrevocable transfer of liability, that sounds scary. Are you sure this is just standard insurance?" Brandon let out a sigh that was half patience, half annoyance, the sound a parent makes when a child asks too many questions at bedtime. He moved behind me, placing his hands on my shoulders and kneading the tension there. His touch made my skin crawl, but I leaned into it, playing the part of the devoted, trusting wife. "It is just legalese, Isabel," he murmured into my ear, his breath smelling of expensive scotch. "Lawyers get paid by the word, so they make everything sound complicated. It just means that if the house floods, the insurance company pays us directly. It protects us. It protects you. Do you trust me?" I turned my head slightly to look at him. His eyes were wide, pleading, but beneath the surface I saw the frantic desperation of a man watching his lifeline dangle by a thread. He needed this signature. Without it, his entire house of cards would collapse before breakfast. I took a deep breath and looked back at the paper. "I trust you, Brandon," I whispered. "I know you would never do anything to hurt our future." I pressed the pen to the paper. The ink flowed smoothly as I wrote my name. Isabel Marie Hayes. I added a flourish at the end, just the way he liked it. As soon as I lifted the pen, Brandon snatched the papers away. He did not even wait for the ink to dry. He flipped through the pages, checking every signature tab, his eyes scanning greedily to ensure I hadn't missed a spot. When he was satisfied, he let out a laugh, a loud, triumphant bark of relief. "Good girl," he said, kissing the top of my head before zipping the document safely back into his leather portfolio. "You did good, babe. You just saved the company." He walked out of the kitchen, whistling, already pulling out his phone to text Terrence that the Eagle had landed. I stood there, leaning against the cold granite counter, and allowed a small, cold smile to touch my lips. Brandon thought he was holding a golden ticket. He had no idea he was holding a death warrant. What my husband did not know, and what his overpriced lawyers apparently forgot to check, was that at 4:59 p.m. that afternoon, exactly 1 minute before the court clerk's office closed, Veronica had electronically filed a petition for legal separation on my behalf. In the state of California, the moment that petition is filed, an automatic temporary restraining order, or ATRO, goes into effect. It freezes everything. It prevents either spouse from transferring, encumbering, or disposing of any property, real or personal, without the written consent of the other party or a court order. By signing that document after the ATRO was in effect, I hadn't taken on his debt. I had just created irrefutable notarized proof that Brandon was attempting to violate a court order and defraud his wife. He was going to walk into that meeting tomorrow and present a document that wasn't just void, it was a felony in waiting. He thought I was the good girl. He was about to find out that I was actually the judge, the jury, and the executioner. While Brandon slept soundly beside me, dreaming of the yacht he was going to buy, his brother was across town, staring at a computer monitor that was delivering his worst nightmare. Terrence was at the Next Gen headquarters, fueled by cheap energy drinks and expensive cocaine, running a final diagnostic on the servers. He wanted to make sure the fabricated books were perfectly polished for the morning meeting. He was expecting to see clean, falsified data. Instead, he saw a ghost. On the secondary monitor, a small red alert blinked in the corner of the network admin panel. It indicated an active session. Terrence leaned in, his bloodshot eyes narrowing. Someone was logged into the system. Not just logged in, but operating with root-level administrator privileges. He watched as a progress bar hit 100%. The notification was simple and terrifying. Full system mirror complete. External download successful. Terrence froze. That was not a glitch. That was an extraction. Someone had just cloned the entire server. Every email, every suppressed financial report, every record of the wire transfers to his shell company in Nevada. It was all gone. "Who is that?" he screamed to the empty office, his voice echoing off the glass walls. He frantically typed on the keyboard, trying to trace the IP address of the intruder. But the connection was bounced through a dozen proxy servers. It was untraceable. It was professional. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his drug-induced haze. He stood up so fast his ergonomic chair flew backward and crashed into the filing cabinets. It had to be a mole. It had to be someone inside the building. No outsider could crack the encryption that fast. He began to tear the office apart. He ripped the phone cords out of the wall, searching for bugs. He overturned the trash cans. He marched into the server room and physically yanked the cables out of the main stack, severing the connection to the outside world. But it was too late. The data was already out. He paced the hallway, raking his hands through his hair. Who was it? Was it the new intern? Was it the janitor? Was it the disgruntled accountant they fired last month? He never once thought of the sister-in-law he had threatened earlier that evening. In his mind, I was just a frightened housewife doing yoga. He could not conceive that the ghost in the machine was the woman he called a liability. He grabbed his phone to call Brandon, his thumb hovering over the contact name. Then he stopped. If he told Brandon that the evidence was compromised 12 hours before the deal, Brandon might panic. Brandon might fold. Or worse, Brandon might cut a deal and throw Terrence under the bus to save himself. Terrence lowered the phone. He decided to gamble. He convinced himself that whoever stole the data did not know what they were looking at yet. It was raw code. It would take weeks to decipher. He just needed to get through the meeting. He needed Dubois to sign the check. Once the money was in the offshore account, it did not matter what the data showed. They would be gone. He sat down on the floor of the ruined office, surrounded by torn paper and tangled wires, and tried to slow his breathing. He did not know that the person who stole the data did not need weeks to decipher it. He did not know that the ghost was already sitting in the courtroom of her mind, polishing the gavel. Brandon returned to the kitchen a moment later, holding a bright orange box. My heart did not skip a beat, but my cynicism certainly spiked. I recognized that shade of orange immediately. It was the signature packaging of Hermes, the ultimate status symbol for the women in his social circle. He held it out to me with both hands, like he was presenting an offering to a deity, a smug grin plastered across his face. "I know things have been stressful lately," he said, placing the box on the counter between us, "and I know I have been asking a lot of you, but I wanted to show you how much I appreciate you standing by me. You deserve the best, Isabel." I looked at the box. I looked at him. This was the carrot. He had used the stick, the fear of poverty, the threat of liability, and now he was offering the reward to ensure I stayed obedient until the ink was dry on the Dubois contract. I reached out and untied the brown ribbon. I lifted the lid. Nestled inside the tissue paper was a black leather Birkin bag with gold hardware. It was the bag every woman in his country club coveted. It was the bag that signaled you had arrived. "Oh, Brandon," I breathed, playing the part of the overwhelmed wife. "You should not have. This must have cost a fortune. The waiting list for these is years." He shrugged, feigning modesty. "I pulled some strings. I have connections. Nothing is too good for my wife." I lifted the bag out of the box. It was heavy. It smelled of leather. To the untrained eye, it was perfection. But as I ran my thumb over the stitching on the handle, I felt the truth. Hermès bags are hand-stitched using a double saddle stitch that is angled and imperfectly perfect. The stitching on this bag was machine straight. The gold hardware was a shade too yellow, lacking the subtle, rich luster of real 24-karat plating. And the smell. Underneath the leather conditioner, there was the faint, sharp tang of industrial glue. It was a fake. It was a high-quality, super fake, likely purchased from the same shady contact who supplied him with his counterfeit watches. But it was a fake nonetheless. He had just asked me to sign away my life to take on $12 million of his debt, and his payment was a $200 knockoff he probably bought out of a trunk in Chinatown. He stood there waiting for my adoration, waiting for me to swoon over his generosity. He truly believed I was that stupid. He thought I was a woman who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. "It is beautiful," I said, hugging the bag to my chest to hide the look of pure disgust on my face. "Thank you, honey. I will wear it to the meeting tomorrow. It will make me feel confident." He beamed, relieved that his cheap bribe had worked. "Perfect," he said, kissing my forehead. "You are going to look like $1,000,000. Now let's get some sleep. Big day tomorrow." He turned and walked toward the bedroom, already mentally spending the money he thought he had secured. I set the bag down on the counter. It sat there shiny and hollow, a perfect metaphor for our entire marriage. He thought he had bought my loyalty with a lie. He did not realize that by giving me this fake bag, he had just given me the final piece of emotional ammunition I needed. I stroked the cheap leather one last time. It was indeed a cheap price for his freedom, but tomorrow the bill for his arrogance would finally come due. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic humming of the refrigerator and the distant sound of wind and rain against the siding. Brandon had gone into his study, closing the heavy mahogany door with a soft click. He thought he was entering his private sanctuary, a soundproof fortress where he could gloat freely. He did not know that 3 hours ago I had slipped a high-sensitivity baby monitor, a cruel relic from the days I still hoped for a family, behind the row of leather-bound encyclopedias on his bookshelf. I sat in the guest room, the receiver in my hand, the volume turned low but clear. The static hissed for a moment, and then I heard the familiar sound of whiskey being poured into a tumbler. Then the punch of buttons being dialed. "Hey, baby," Brandon's voice crackled through the speaker. It was different from the voice he used with me. It was lighter, younger, unburdened by the weight of the lies he told to my face. "She is asleep," he continued. "Out like a light. I think the stress of being useful finally got to her." I heard a woman's laugh on the other end. It was tinny and distorted, but I recognized Camila's giggle instantly. "Did she sign them?" Camila asked. "Signed, sealed, and delivered," Brandon crowed. He sounded drunk on victory. "I told you, Cammy, she is simple." I waved a fake insurance policy in her face, gave her a knockoff bag, and she thanked me for it. She literally thanked me for ruining her life. It was almost too easy. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. I stared at the little plastic device in my hand. I did not feel anger anymore. I felt the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a specimen. So, what is the timeline? Camilla asked. I do not want to wait anymore, Brandon. I am tired of living in that apartment. Tomorrow, Brandon promised. We meet Dubois at 9 a.m. I present the growth numbers. I show him the new liability waiver proving the company is debt-free because my loving wife took the hit. He signs the check. As soon as the wire hits the offshore account, I am texting the lawyers. He took a sip of his drink. I could hear the ice clinking against the glass. I want her served with divorce papers by 5 p.m. tomorrow, he said. I want her out of this house before the weekend. She can take her clothes and that ugly car. Everything else stays. The house, the accounts, the art. It is all ours, Cammy. We are going to Paris. First class. I leaned back against the headboard. Paris. The city where we had spent our honeymoon. The city where I had learned the language he thought kept him safe. I love you, Brandon. Camilla cooed. You are a genius. I am, aren't I? He replied. Get some sleep, beautiful. Tomorrow is the first day of our real lives. He hung up. I heard him humming to himself the happy, tuneless sound of a man who thinks he has gotten away with murder. I reached out and clicked the monitor off. The room plunged back into silence. He was right about one thing. Tomorrow was the first day of a new life, but it was not the one he was planning. He thought he was waking up to a $50 million wire transfer and a flight to France. Instead, he was waking up to a federal indictment and a permanent residence in a correctional facility. I pulled the duvet up to my chin and closed my eyes. For the first time in months, I fell asleep instantly. There is a specific kind of peace that comes when you know exactly how the story ends and you are the one holding the pen. The alarm did not go off. Instead, I was jolted awake by the sensation of the duvet being ripped off my body. The room was gray with the pre-dawn light of a stormy San Francisco morning. Brandon was standing over the bed, already dressed in his charcoal suit, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. Get up, he barked, tossing a dress onto the mattress. It hit me in the face, a navy blue sheath dress, conservative but form-fitting. The uniform of the supportive executive wife. Brandon. I sat up, blinking against the harsh overhead light he had just flicked on. What is happening? It is 6 in the morning. Dubois just called. He said, his voice tight with panic. He is threatening to walk. He says he needs to see us, both of us. In his office at 8 a.m. sharp, I rubbed my eyes, feigning confusion. Why I thought the deal was done. I signed the papers. I do not know, Brandon shouted, running a hand through his perfectly gelled hair. He said something about verifying the human element. He wants to look us in the eye before he wires the funds. He is old school. He probably just wants to make sure we are the perfect American family he is investing in. So get up and fix your face. He paced the room while I climbed out of bed, his energy frantic and toxic. He was terrified. He was usually so composed, but the threat of losing $50 million had cracked his veneer. And Isabel, he said, stopping in front of me and gripping my shoulders hard. Look alive. Put on the heavy concealer. You look tired. I need you to look fresh, happy, and expensive. Dubois needs to see a trophy, not a tired housewife. Wear the pearls. Wear the new bag I gave you. Do not speak unless he asks you a direct question. Just smile and nod. Can you handle that? I looked into his eyes. They were wide with desperation. He was asking me to put on a costume to help him rob me. I can handle it, I said softly. Good. You have 20 minutes. He stormed out of the room to scream at someone on the phone. Probably Terrence. I walked into the bathroom and closed the door. I looked at myself in the mirror. My hair was messy, my eyes puffy from sleep. Brandon saw a liability that needed to be painted over. I saw a soldier preparing for battle. I opened my makeup bag. I applied the foundation covering the stress lines. I put on the blush, creating the illusion of a healthy, happy glow. I lined my lips with precision and applied the red lipstick he loved. It was war paint. I put on the navy dress. It fit like a glove, restricting my movement, designed to make me sit still and look pretty. I clasped the pearls around my neck, the ones he had bought with a company credit card 3 years ago. Finally, I picked up the fake Hermes bag from the counter. It felt heavy in my hand, weighed down not by my personal items, but by the encrypted hard drive I had slipped into the inner pocket. I walked out of the bedroom. Brandon was waiting by the door, checking his watch, tapping his foot incessantly. He looked me up and down, assessing me like a piece of livestock at an auction. "Fine," he muttered. "You will do. Let's go. We cannot be late." He opened the door and ushered me out into the rain. He thought he was dragging his silent partner to seal his victory. He did not know he was driving the key witness to his own trial. The car ride was silent, but the air was thick with the impending crash. We were not going to a meeting. We were going to a slaughter. And for the first time in our marriage, I was not the one on the chopping block. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt less like an ascent and more like the slow mechanical click of a roller coaster climbing the final hill before the drop. We were encased in a glass capsule rising rapidly above the fog line of San Francisco. To my left, the city sprawl looked like a circuit board, gray and indifferent. To my right, Brandon stood facing the polished steel doors, adjusting his silk tie for the 10th time. He was vibrating with a mixture of greed and terror, checking his reflection to ensure the mask of the successful CEO was firmly in place. Terrence stood behind us, a looming, volatile shadow. In the confined space, the smell of him was suffocating, a toxic blend of expensive cologne, stale cigarette smoke, and the metallic tang of fear sweat. He was twitching slightly, his eyes darting to the floor numbers as they climbed higher. 30, 35, 38. Suddenly, Terrence stepped forward, invading my personal space. He used his large frame to block me from the security camera in the corner, pressing me into the back rail of the elevator. Brandon did not turn around. He did not defend me. He just kept fixing his hair, complicit in his silence. Terrence leaned down, his lips brushing against my ear. His voice was a wet, ragged whisper that made my skin crawl. "Listen to me closely, sister-in-law," he hissed. "I do not care what game you think you are playing with that smile. You walk in there, you look pretty, and you sign the paper. If you hesitate, if you stutter, if you even look at Dubois the wrong way, you are not making it back to the car." I felt the hard pressure of his hand on my lower back, right over my kidney. It was not a caress, it was a target. "Do you understand?" he threatened. "Accidents happen fast, Isabel. It would be a shame if you tripped and fell off a balcony before the divorce went through." I looked at his reflection in the glass. His eyes were bloodshot and wild. He was a cornered animal, dangerous and unpredictable, but he made a critical error. He assumed I was afraid of dying. He did not realize that the woman he was threatening had already died 1,000 deaths over the last 3 years of their betrayal. The Isabel standing in this elevator was just the ghost who had come back to haunt them. "I understand perfectly, Terrence," I whispered back, my voice steady and cold. "I will do exactly what needs to be done." He pulled back, satisfied, mistaking my resolve for submission. He straightened his jacket and wiped a bead of sweat from his upper lip. "Good girl," he sneered. The elevator chimed, a soft, cheerful bell that sounded absurdly bright given the darkness of the moment. The number 42 glowed overhead. The heavy steel doors slid open with a smooth hiss, revealing the expansive marble-floored reception area of the private equity firm where Monsieur Dubois was holding court. Brandon turned to me, flashing his practiced camera-ready smile. "It is showtime, babe," he said, offering me his arm. I looked at his arm, the arm that had held me while I cried over false negatives, the arm that had stolen my mother's jewels. I looped my arm through his, clutching my fake Hermes bag tight against my side. Inside that bag, the encrypted hard drive seemed to pulse with heat. "Let's go," I said. We stepped out of the elevator and walked toward the heavy double doors at the end of the hall. They walked with the swagger of men who thought they were about to conquer the world. I walked with the quiet precision of a demolition expert who had already set the charges and was just waiting to press the button. The heavy double doors swung open to reveal a conference room that felt more like an interrogation chamber than a place of business. One entire wall was floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the fog rolling over the Golden Gate Bridge, but inside the air was sterile and cold. At the far end of a mahogany table long enough to land a small aircraft on sat Monsieur Dubois. He did not stand up. He remained seated, his fingers steepled in front of him, flanked by three men in sharp gray suits who looked less like lawyers and more like undertakers. Brandon tightened his grip on my arm, his fingers digging into my bicep before flashing his 1,000-watt smile. Monsieur Dubois. Brandon boomed, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. It is an honor. Thank you for accommodating us on such short notice. Dubois looked at us over the rim of his spectacles. His expression was unreadable, a stone mask of indifference. He gestured vaguely to the empty chairs on the opposite side of the table. Sit, he commanded, his voice dry and devoid of warmth. We have much to discuss, and my attorneys have a plane to catch. We sat. I took the seat to Brandon's right, placing my fake Hermes bag on the table with deliberate care. Terrence slouched into the chair on Brandon's left, looking like a teenager called to the principal's office. Brandon wasted no time. He opened his leather portfolio and began his pitch in English, sliding the falsified growth charts across the polished wood. As you can see, Monsieur Dubois, the Q3 projections are even stronger than we anticipated, Brandon said, tapping a graph that I knew for a fact he had photoshopped at 2 a.m. User acquisition is up 40%. Our burn rate is minimal. NextGen is not just a company, it is a revolution. Dubois picked up the chart, glancing at it with boredom. He did not look impressed. He looked like a man waiting for the other shoe to drop. The numbers are pretty. Mr. Hayes Dubois said, his accent thick, but his English perfect. But numbers can be painted. I am interested in this foundation. The stability. Brandon sensed the skepticism. I saw a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. He decided to play his ace. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone, and switched languages. If you do not mind, Monsieur Dubois, perhaps we can speak in French. Brandon asked, his accent fluent, but arrogant. It is the language of diplomacy after all, and it allows us to speak freely. He gestured dismissively toward me, with his hand a flick of the wrist that treated me like a piece of furniture. My wife Isabelle. She is a lovely woman. Brandon continued in French, smiling at me as he insulted me. But she is not built for this world. She does not speak the language of business, or France for that matter. She is here purely for the optics, to sign where I tell her to sign. I kept my face perfectly still. I widened my eyes slightly, giving him the vacant, supportive wife look he expected. Dubois shifted his gaze to me. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, and searching. He knew exactly who was on the phone yesterday. He was testing me. Is that so? Dubois replied in French, his voice smooth. She seems quite attentive for someone who does not understand. Brandon laughed, a condescending sound. Oh, she tries. But honestly, she is more interested in spending the profits than earning them. She is a simple creature, domestic, safe. That is why I am transferring the liability to her name. She will sign anything I put in front of her, because she trusts me implicitly. It is the perfect arrangement for us, is it not? I dug my fingernails into my palms under the table. He was selling me out in real time, mocking my intelligence, to the very man I had secretly briefed. He thought he was speaking in code. He thought he was safe. He had no idea that every insult he spoke was just another nail I would use to seal his coffin. I smiled at Brandon, a soft, loving smile. Is everything okay, honey? I asked in English, blinking rapidly. You sound so serious. Brandon patted my hand, looking at Dubois with a smirk. Everything is perfect, babe, he said in English. I was just telling Monsieur Dubois how lucky I am to have such a supportive partner. I squeezed his hand back. You have no idea, Brandon, I thought. You have absolutely no idea. Monsieur Dubois leaned back in his leather chair, the springs groaning under the weight of the silence. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and picked up the document Brandon had placed in front of him, the fraudulent insurance waiver, that was actually a transfer of debt. He studied it for a long, agonizing minute, his eyes darting back and forth between the legal text and my husband's eager, sweating face. Then Dubois looked at me. His gaze was piercing, stripping away the layers of foundation and the expensive pearls. He was not looking at the trophy wife Brandon had described. He was looking for the whistleblower who had called him from a burner phone in the rain. He cleared his throat and spoke in French, his voice sharp and devoid of the diplomatic warmth he had shown earlier. Monsieur Hayes, he began tapping a manicured finger on Clause 4B. This provision is aggressive. You are asking your wife to personally guarantee the initial tranche of the loan. If the valuation drops by even 5%, or if the audit uncovers any irregularities, she becomes personally liable for the entire $12 million. She would lose her home, her savings, everything. Dubois paused, his eyes locking onto Brandon's. Are you absolutely certain, Monsieur Hayes, that your wife understands she is putting her own neck in the noose for your ambition? Does she truly agree to mortgage her personal assets for this gamble? Brandon did not flinch. His arrogance was a shield that deflected all logic. He laughed, a dismissive sound that grated against the sterile glass walls of the conference room. Monsieur Dubois, please, Brandon replied in French, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. As I told you, Isabelle is a creature of comfort. She does not concern herself with the mechanics of the engine, only that the car drives fast. She trusts me to handle the terrifying details. Watch. Brandon turned to me. The sneer vanished, replaced instantly by the mask of the doting protective husband. He leaned in close, his cologne suffocating me, and smiled. Honey, he said in English, his voice dropping to a gentle, patronizing coo. Monsieur Dubois is just making small talk. He is very proud of his office location. He wants to know if you like the view. He is asking if you think it is impressive. I felt a cold rage settle in the pit of my stomach. It was so simple, so evil. He was translating my financial ruin into a question about the scenery. He was banking on my ignorance, betting his life on the fact that I was too stupid to know the difference between collateral and clouds. I looked at Dubois. I saw the slightest twitch at the corner of his mouth. He was waiting. I turned my gaze to the window, staring out at the gray fog swirling around the Golden Gate Bridge. I took a deep breath, channeling every ounce of the dim-witted housewife persona I had cultivated for 3 years. Oh yes, I said, turning back to Brandon with a bright, vacant smile. It is absolutely breathtaking, Brandon. I have never seen anything like it. Tell him I think it is perfect. Brandon turned back to Dubois, his chest puffing out with triumph. You see, he said in French, spreading his hands wide. She loves it. She is fully on board. She is practically begging to sign the papers. Dubois looked at me one last time. There was no pity in his eyes, only a cold, hard respect. He nodded slowly. Very well, Dubois said, opening a silver fountain pen. If the lady is happy with the view, then who am I to stand in the way of such blind devotion? Let us proceed. Terence could not handle the silence anymore. The subtle dance of diplomacy and double meanings was lost on him. To him, this was a drug deal in a boardroom, and he was itching to get the cash and run. He slammed his heavy hand onto the polished mahogany table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. The vibration rattled the water glasses and made the lawyers jump. Hey, excuse me, Terence barked in broken, aggressive English, pointing a shaking finger at the paperwork. We do not have all day to talk about the view. Sign the papers, Dubois. We have other investors waiting. We are busy men. Let's move this along. Brandon closed his eyes for a brief second, a flicker of intense annoyance crossing his face. He looked like a man trying to housebreak a Rottweiler in a china shop. He quickly composed himself, flashing a tight, apologetic smile at Monsieur Dubois. My brother is enthusiastic about efficiency, Brandon said in English, kicking Terence under the table. Please forgive his lack of decorum. He is the numbers guy, not the people person. Dubois did not look at Terence. He treated the outburst with the disdain one might show a fly buzzing around a fine wine. He simply raised an eyebrow and turned his attention back to Brandon. Enthusiasm is good, Monsieur Hayes. Dubois said, his voice cool. But haste makes waste, as they say. We must ensure all parties are protected, especially your wife. Brandon leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He decided to close the distance to bring Dubois into his confidence one last time. He lowered his voice, switching seamlessly back into French, the language he was certain I could not understand. He spoke with the casual cruelty of a sociopath discussing the weather. Do not worry about Isabelle's protection, Monsieur Dubois. Brandon said, his voice smooth and low. Between us men, let me be frank. The debt transfer is just the first step. It is a temporary measure. Dubois tilted his head, feigning curiosity. Oh, and what is the second step? Brandon smirked, a look of pure, unadulterated malice. The moment the wire transfer hits my offshore account, I am making a call to the district attorney. You see, I have spent the last 6 months planting a trail of digital breadcrumbs, falsified logs, unauthorized transfers from her IP address, signatures on accounts she does not know exist. He took a sip of water, savoring his own brilliance. By the time the sun sets tonight, Isabel will not just be liable for the debt, she will be in handcuffs. I have framed her for the embezzlement of the $12 million. The police will find the stolen funds in an account under her name. I walk away, the victim of a conniving wife, and she goes to federal prison for a decade. It is a clean break. No alimony. No messy divorce. Just justice. I sat there frozen in my chair. The air in the room seemed to vanish. I had suspected he wanted to leave me penniless. I had suspected he wanted to humiliate me. But this was not just greed. This was destruction. He was not just stealing my money. He was planning to steal my freedom. He was going to lock me in a cage for crimes he committed so he could sip champagne in Paris with his mistress. The last microscopic grain of guilt I had felt about what I was about to do evaporated. The love I had once held for him didn't just die. It was incinerated. I looked at his profile, the handsome jawline, the perfectly styled hair, and I saw a monster. Dubois looked at Brandon for a long moment. His expression was a mixture of horror and fascination, like watching a snake eat its own tail. "You are remarkably thorough," Monsieur Hayes Dubois said quietly. "I like to be prepared," Brandon replied, winking. "Now shall we sign?" I placed my hands in my lap to hide the fact that I had balled them into fists. The time for listening was over. The time for acting had arrived. He wanted a signature, I would give him one, but it wouldn't be on the paper he expected. Brandon reached for the silver fountain pen, his hand trembling slightly with anticipation. The moment he had been orchestrating for 6 months had finally arrived. He was seconds away from signing his name to a fortune and signing my life away to a prison cell. The air in the room was thick with the smell of old money and fresh betrayal. I did not reach for the pen. I reached for the hem of my jacket, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle with a slow, deliberate motion. Then I pushed my chair back. The sound of the legs scraping against the marble floor was sharp and violent, cutting through the silence like a knife. Brandon's head snapped toward me. His eyes were wide, confused, flashing with a warning. "Isabel," he hissed in English, his voice tight. "What are you doing?" "Sit down. You are making a scene." I ignored him. I stood up, but I did not stand like the cowering, confused wife he had dragged out of bed at dawn. I straightened my spine, growing 3 inches taller in my heels. I rolled my shoulders back, shedding the hunch of the victim. I looked at the glass wall, then at Terrence, then at Brandon. My face was no longer a mask of vacuous support. It was a mask of cold, hard judgment. I turned my gaze to Monsieur Dubois, locking eyes with the man who held the checkbook. I did not smile. "Actually, Monsieur Dubois," I said, my voice dropping an octave. I did not speak in English. I spoke in French. But it was not the halting tourist-grade French Brandon used to order wine. It was flawless. It was the rapid, crisp, aristocratic Parisian French I had perfected during my exchange years at the Sorbonne, a detail of my life Brandon had never bothered to ask about because he was too busy talking about himself. "There is a slight error in my husband's narrative." I continued, the words flowing like silk and steel. "The evidence of embezzlement he is referring to the $12 million stolen from the Series B funding round. You will not find it in my personal accounts." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a bomb that has landed but not yet detonated. Brandon froze, his hands suspended in mid-air, the pen slipping from his sweaty fingers and clattering onto the table. His mouth opened but no sound came out. He looked like a man trying to process a physics equation that proved the earth was flat. I took a step toward the table, resting my hands on the polished wood, leaning in to deliver the final blow. "You will, however, find the digital trail leading directly to a shell company called Titanium Holdings, registered in Nevada," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on Dubois. "And the physical ledger. The one detailing the bribes paid to local officials and the gambling debts settled in Las Vegas. That is currently sitting in a fireproof safe in Terrence's apartment in the Marina District. The combination is 0429. His birthday." I turned my head slowly to look at Brandon. The color had drained from his face so completely he looked like a corpse. His eyes were bulging, darting between me and Dubois, trying to comprehend the nightmare unfolding in front of him. "You really should have read my personnel file more carefully before you married me, darling," I said, switching back to English for his benefit, my voice dripping with disdain. I didn't just study art history, I minored in French literature, and I majored in forensic accounting. Terence made a choking sound, stumbling back from the table as if I had pulled a gun. In a way I had. I had just pulled the trigger on their entire world. Brandon looked at me as if the furniture had suddenly grown teeth and bitten him. His mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock, gasping for air that wasn't there. The arrogant, smooth-talking CEO was gone, replaced by a terrified little boy, realizing the monster in the closet was real. "You," he stammered the word, choking him. You speak French. Since when? You watched reality TV. You bought curtains." He looked at Terence, then back at me, his eyes searching for the punchline of a joke he didn't understand. "I thought you were simple." He whispered, the truth of his perception finally spoken aloud. I let out a short, cold laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. It was the sound of a gavel striking wood. I switched seamlessly back to English, my voice stripping away the soft, breathy cadence I had used for 3 years. I adopted the sharp-clipped tone of the boardroom, the voice of a woman who used to eat men like him for breakfast on the trading floor. "I have a master's degree in computational linguistics from the Sorbonne." "Brandon," I said, taking a slow step toward him, "and a second master's in quantitative finance from Wharton." I was the lead risk analyst for a global hedge fund before I decided to take a break. I stopped inches from his face. I could smell the fear radiating off him, sour and pungent beneath his expensive cologne. "You never asked," I said softly. "In 3 years of marriage, you never once asked to see my resume. You never asked about my life before you. You just saw a pretty face and assumed there was nothing behind it. You assumed I was an empty vessel for you to fill with your lies. That was your first mistake. And this," I said, reaching into the fake Hermes bag, "was your second." I pulled out a thick, bound document. It wasn't the flimsy insurance waiver he had printed. It was a forensic audit. The cover was heavy cardstock, and the binding was professional grade. I did not hand it to him. I tossed it onto the mahogany table with a heavy, authoritative thud that echoed in the silent room. It slid across the polished surface, spinning slightly until it came to rest directly in front of Monsieur Dubois. "That is the real ledger," I announced, my voice filling the room. "It details every dollar you stole, every wire transfer to Nevada, every faked invoice. It also contains the metadata from the server logs proving you and Terence altered the Q3 reports last night at 2 a.m. Terence made a move, lunging toward the table to grab the file, but one of Dubois' bodyguards stepped forward, blocking him with a wall of muscle. Terence froze, his hands shaking, realizing he was physically and legally cornered. Brandon stared at the document. He looked at the title on the cover, Next Gen Technologies Forensic Audit of Financial Irregularities and Embezzlement Protocols. "But you signed," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You signed the waiver last night. You took the debt." I smiled, and it was the coldest thing in the room. I signed a piece of paper after filing for a legal separation and an automatic restraining order on all assets at 4:59 p.m. yesterday, I said. "That signature is legally void. It is just ink on paper, Brandon. The only thing I successfully signed last night was your confession." I turned back to the window, looking out at the fog one last time. "The view really is beautiful, isn't it?" I asked. "It is a shame the only view you will have for the next 10 years is a concrete wall and a set of iron bars." The silence in the room shattered the moment the reality of the safe combination hit Terence. His face went from pale to a mottled, violent shade of purple. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his collar, pulsing with the frantic rhythm of a man who sees his life ending. He didn't look at the audit. He looked at me. And in his eyes, I saw the raw, animalistic panic of a cornered rat who realizes the trap has already snapped shut. "You bitch!" he screamed, the sound tearing through the refined atmosphere of the conference room. You think you are smart. You think you can play me. I will kill you. He didn't just threaten. He moved. He shoved the heavy mahogany table with a grunt of exertion, knocking over the pitcher of water, and lunged toward me. His hands were clawed, reaching for my throat. Brandon scrambled backward, tripping over his own chair in his haste to get away from his brother's exploding rage. I did not move. I did not flinch. I simply watched him come, calculating the distance, knowing exactly how this scene had been choreographed. Just as Terrence's fingers were inches from my jacket, the side door of the conference room, the one concealing the catering staff, burst open with a deafening crash. Federal agents, get on the ground. Now. The command was a wall of sound. 6 agents in Kevlar vests poured into the room, weapons drawn, moving with practiced, lethal efficiency. Terrence tried to pivot, tried to run toward the glass wall, but he was too slow and too heavy. A tactical officer slammed into him at full speed, tackling him to the marble floor with a bone-jarring thud. The wind was knocked out of him, but he continued to struggle, thrashing and cursing, spitting venom at the floor. "Get off me! You have nothing! You have nothing!" he howled, his voice cracking. Special Agent Miller walked into the room, stepping calmly over the spilled water. He looked exactly as I remembered him from our days at the agency, tired, unkempt, and utterly unimpressed by white-collar criminals. He holstered his weapon and looked down at the man writhing on the floor. "Terrence Hayes, you are under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny." Miller recited, his voice bored and bureaucratic. He leaned down, bringing his face close to Terrence's ear. "And thanks to the audio recording device your sister-in-law was wearing in the elevator, we are adding a charge for communicating a threat of violence and attempted assault. You really should not have talked about accidents on the balcony, son. Juries hate that." The officer on Terrence's back yanked his arms behind him. The metallic click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the room. It was the sound of finality. Terrence went limp, the fight draining out of him as the cold steel bit into his wrists. He looked up at me from the floor, his eyes wet with tears of rage and self-pity. "Isabel, please," he whimpered, the tough guy facade crumbling instantly. Tell them it was a joke. We are family." I looked down at him, my expression impassive. I adjusted my pearls, ensuring they were perfectly centered. "Family protects family, Terrence," I said, my voice ice cold. "But as you pointed out at dinner, sometimes you have to cut out the rot to save the tree." 2 agents hauled him to his feet and dragged him toward the door. He was weeping openly now, begging Brandon to do something, but Brandon was pressed against the far wall, shaking like a leaf, unable to even look his brother in the eye. As the doors closed behind Terrence, the room fell silent again. Now it was just the 3 of us. The investor, the wife, and the husband who had just realized he was next. Monsieur Dubois stood up slowly, the movement heavy with finality. He closed the leather folder in front of him with a sharp snap that sounded like a coffin lid slamming shut. He looked at Brandon, not with anger, but with the utter disdain a man reserves for something he stepped in on the sidewalk. Monsieur Hayes Dubois said, his voice clipped and cold. "Consider the deal terminated immediately. My legal team will be filing a formal complaint with the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding your fraudulent financial statements. And as for your attempt to use my firm to launder money, I imagine the federal prosecutors will have quite a few questions about that. Good day." He turned his back on us and walked toward the door, flanked by his stone-faced attorneys. The sound of their footsteps retreating was the sound of $50 million evaporating into thin air. Brandon stood alone in the center of the room. He looked at the closed door, then at the empty chair where his future used to be. Then slowly, terrifyingly, he turned to me. His face crumpled. The arrogance, the swagger, the CEO persona, it all dissolved into a pathetic mask of panic. He did not scream. He did not run. He dropped to his knees. "Isabel," he choked out, crawling across the marble floor until he was clutching the hem of my navy dress. "Baby, please, you have to help me. You have to tell them I didn't know." It was Terrence. It was all Terrence. He made me do it. He said he would hurt us if I didn't cook the books. He grabbed my hand, his palms sweating, squeezing my fingers with desperate strength. "I love you, Issy," he sobbed, tears streaming down his face. "I did this for us. I wanted to give us the life you deserve. I would never hurt you. I am your husband. I looked down at him. I looked at the man who had promised to love and cherish me. I looked at the man who had plotted to leave me penniless and in prison. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no love, no hate, just the crushing weight of indifference. I pulled my hand away from his grip as if his touch were corrosive acid. I took a step back, smoothing the fabric of my dress where he had wrinkled it. Do not call me that, I said, my voice quiet and deadly calm. And do not ever call yourself my husband again. I looked him in the eye. You say you love me, Brandon? Is that why you gave me a counterfeit Hermes bag to buy my silence? Is that why you planned to frame me for embezzlement while you ran off to Paris with your secretary? He froze, his mouth hanging open, unable to form a lie fast enough. And the worst part isn't the money. I continued, my voice trembling slightly with the only emotion I allowed to surface. It isn't even Camila, it is the smoothies. Brandon flinched as if I had struck him. I found the emails to the pharmacy in Mexico, Brandon. I know about the desogestrel. I know you have been crushing contraceptive pills into my breakfast every morning for 3 years while watching me cry over negative pregnancy tests. You let me believe I was broken. You let me believe I was barren. You poisoned me to keep me childless because a baby didn't fit into your escape plan. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small orange prescription bottle. I tossed it onto the floor next to his knees. My lawyer will be in touch regarding the divorce settlement, the fraud lawsuit, and the charges for medical battery. I suggest you find a very good attorney, Brandon. Although, since I just froze all your assets, I doubt you can afford one. I turned my back on him. I heard him sobbing my name, a broken, pathetic sound echoing in the empty boardroom. I walked toward the elevator, my heels clicking on the marble, walking away from the wreckage of my marriage and into the rest of my life. The federal agents did not use velvet gloves. I stood by the glass wall, my back to the view Brandon had tried to sell me, and watched the final collapse of his empire. Brandon was weeping openly now, a stream of incoherent begging that echoed off the marble floors as he was hauled to his feet. He looked at me one last time, his eyes searching for the submissive wife who would fix everything, but he found only a stranger in a navy dress. I did not turn away. I forced myself to watch until the heavy double doors swallowed him and the agents whole. It was the closure I needed. The man who had poisoned my body and stolen my mother's legacy was gone. Across the city, the second act of the tragedy was unfolding at San Francisco International Airport. Camila stood at the first-class check-in counter for Air France, tapping her foot impatiently. She was wearing a trench coat and oversized sunglasses, looking every inch the glamorous fugitive. She pushed her passport across the counter. One way to Paris, she demanded, checking her phone for the 10th time. Why wasn't Brandon answering? The agent typed for a moment, then frowned. I am sorry, Miss Russo. This card has been declined. Camila scoffed. That is impossible. Try it again. It is a corporate platinum card. The agent swiped it again. Declined. Camila felt the first prick of panic. She pulled out another card. Brandon's personal supplemental card. Try this one, she snapped. Declined. Reported stolen. Camila's hands began to shake. She grabbed her purse, ready to run, but when she turned around, 2 men in dark suits were blocking her path. They didn't look like tourists. Camila Russo, one of them asked, flashing a badge. We have a warrant for your arrest regarding conspiracy to commit wire fraud and aiding and abetting a fugitive. Please place your hands behind your back. The last thing she saw before the handcuffs clicked was the notification on her phone screen. A news alert. Next Gen CEO and CFO arrested in massive fraud scheme. Back in the boardroom, the silence was heavy but clean. The air felt lighter without the lies consuming the oxygen. I sat at the head of the mahogany table, but not in Brandon's chair. I had ordered that chair removed. I sat in my own. Across from me sat Sarah, the company's pragmatic chief operations officer. She had been sidelined by Brandon for years because she asked too many difficult questions. Now she looked at me with a mixture of awe and trepidation. So let me get this straight, Sarah said, looking at the stack of legal documents I had just placed on the table. You bought the debt. Technically, a holding company called Phoenix Ventures bought the debt from the distressed lenders an hour ago, I explained, signing the final page of the transfer agreement. And since I am the sole proprietor of Phoenix Ventures, yes, I own the debt. Which means, effectively, I own NextGen. I capped my pen. The same pen Brandon had tried to make me use to sign my death warrant. I am converting the debt into equity. I continued. The company is solvent again. But I am not a CEO, Sarah. I am an analyst. I find the rot. I do not rebuild the house. I slid the binder across the table to her. That is your job. I am appointing you interim CEO, effective immediately. Your first task is to cooperate fully with the SEC investigation. Your second task is to fire anyone who knew about the titanium account. Sarah picked up the binder, her hands steady. She nodded once. Consider it done, Isabel. I stood up and picked up my bag, the real one this time. My work here was finished. I had dismantled the bomb, captured the terrorists, and cleared the wreckage. I walked out of the glass office without looking back. I had a life to reclaim, and for the first time in 3 years, the path ahead was terrifyingly, wonderfully clear. The rain of San Francisco felt like a lifetime ago. Here in the first arrondissement of Paris, the morning sun hit the cobblestones of Rue de Rivoli like spilled gold. I sat at a small round marble table outside Le Café Marly, looking out at the glass pyramid of the Louvre. I was not wearing the navy sheath dress of a corporate wife anymore. I was wearing a cream silk blouse and tailored trousers that actually fit my frame. On the chair next to me sat a Birkin bag. A real one this time. I had bought it with the dividends from the first profitable quarter of the new NextGen. Monsieur Dubois arrived precisely on time. But the stiff, suspicious posture he had held in that cold boardroom 6 months ago was gone. He approached the table with a warm smile, kissing me on both cheeks, the greeting of a peer, not a superior. Bonjour, Isabelle, he said, pulling out the chair opposite me. You look radiant. Paris suits you far better than the Silicon Valley fog. It does, Jean-Pierre, I replied, signaling the waiter for 2 espressos. The air is cleaner here, less pollution, fewer lies. He laughed, a genuine sound that startled a pigeon near our feet. He placed a leather folder on the table between us. It was not an audit this time. It was a partnership agreement for a new venture in renewable energy. I reviewed your notes on the acquisition, he said, opening the file. Your risk assessment was brutal, Isabel. You tore their valuation apart. I smiled, taking a sip of sparkling water. I did not tear it apart. I simply removed the inflation. They were hiding debt in their operational costs, just like Brandon did. It seems to be a popular hobby among mediocre men. If we are going to co-invest, I want clean books. Dubois nodded, looking at me with undisguised respect. You have a terrifying eye for detail. The board is terrified of you, you know. They call you the auditor. I shrugged. Better to be feared for my competence than pitied for my blindness. Speaking of which, have you heard the news from California? Dubois's expression turned somber. The sentencing hearing, I nodded. 8 years for Brandon, 12 for Terrence, given the assault charge and the history of violence. And Camilla took a plea deal to testify. She is currently working at a cosmetics counter in a mall in Ohio. Dubois stirred his coffee slowly. Do you feel satisfied? I looked at the Louvre, thinking about the woman I was 6 months ago, scared, poisoned, and trapped in a house that wasn't a home. Then I looked at the woman reflected in the cafe window. My skin was clear. The toxins from the crushed pills were finally out of my system. My doctor in Zurich said my fertility markers were returning to normal. I had my body back, I had my mind back, and I had my money back with interest. I do not feel satisfied, Jean-Pierre, I said, leaning back in my chair and letting the sun warm my face. Satisfaction implies an ending. I feel like I am just getting started. I picked up the pen, my own pen, and pulled the contract toward me. Now, about this clause regarding the Swiss accounts, I said, my voice sharp and professional. I think we can restructure the tax liability if we route the initial capital through Phoenix Ventures. Dubois smiled and picked up his espresso. I am listening, partner. I began to speak my French flawless, my confidence absolute. The victim was dead. The survivor was retired. The woman sitting at the table was the one running the game. The waiter returned to the table, clearing away Monsieur Dubois's empty cup. He placed a small silver tray down. On it sat the bill and a single forwarded envelope. It was gray, made of cheap recycled pulp, and stamped in red ink San Quentin State Prison. Inmate mail. Censored. I picked it up. The paper felt gritty against my fingertips, a stark contrast to the heavy linen napkin on my lap. I didn't need a letter opener. The adhesive was weak, peeling away with a pathetic rasp. I unfolded the single sheet of lined paper. Brandon's handwriting, once so arrogant and sweeping, was now cramped and shaky. Isabel, it read. I know you hate me. I know I deserve it. But please, the food here is rot. I have no money for the commissary. Terrence takes everything I get. Just send $50, please. I am begging you. I am starving. I read it twice. Not because I was considering it, but because I was memorizing the feeling of absolute indifference. The man who had worn $5,000 suits and eaten Wagyu beef on my dime was now begging for instant noodles and a chocolate bar. He wanted mercy. He wanted me to remember the man I married. But I remembered the man who drugged my breakfast. I remembered the man who looked me in the eye and lied about our future while stealing my past. I did not tear the letter. That would have required energy. That would have implied emotion. Instead, I folded it neatly in half, placing Brandon's desperate scrawl face up on the marble table. I picked up my hot espresso cup, the bottom still wet with condensation, and set it down firmly right in the center of the paper. The dark liquid bled into the cheap fiber, creating a perfect brown ring over the word, please. It was the only response he was ever going to get. My phone buzzed on the table next to the ruined letter. I glanced at the screen. It was a message from Julian, the charming pediatric surgeon I had met at a gallery opening last month. He wasn't a CEO. He wasn't obsessed with status. He was kind. He listened. And most importantly, he was honest. Results are in the text read. Everything is perfect. Strong heartbeat. See you at dinner. I touched my stomach. It was a reflexive, protective gesture. The doctors in Zurich had told me the damage from the contraceptives might be permanent. They said the toxicity levels Brandon had exposed me to were severe. But I had detoxed. I had fought. And just like I had purged his debt from my finances, my body had purged his poison from my veins. I was pregnant. Not a trophy wife. Not a victim. A mother. I typed back, I will be there. And Julienne. We have something to celebrate. I stood up, leaving a €20 note on the table, enough to cover the coffee and the disposal of the trash I had left behind. I picked up my bag and walked out onto the Rue de Rivoli. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. I didn't look back at the cafe. I didn't think about the man in the cell. The best revenge wasn't seeing him suffer. The best revenge was forgetting he existed at all. I took a deep breath of the crisp Parisian air and walked toward the metro. My life was just beginning. I walked across the Pont des Arts, the wooden planks beneath my boots echoing the rhythm of a city that demands nothing from you but your presence. The wind off the Seine was cool, carrying the scent of rain and roasting chestnuts, a stark contrast to the sterile, air-conditioned chill of the next-gen offices. I stopped in the middle of the bridge and leaned against the railing, watching the bateau mouches drift by below, their lights dancing on the dark water. For 3 years, I lived in a world of noise. Brandon's boasting, Terrence's threats, the constant buzzing hum of their ambition and their greed. They filled every room they entered with their voices, terrified of silence, because silence forces you to think. Silence forces you to look at yourself. And when you are a fraud, that is the most dangerous thing in the world. They looked at me and saw a void. They saw a quiet wife, a prop, a background character who existed solely to applaud their performance. They mistook my silence for submission. They mistook my patience for ignorance. They thought that because I was not speaking, I was not thinking. That was their fatal error. In the world of high-stakes finance, and in the world of high-stakes survival, the loudest person in the room is rarely the one in control. The one in control is the one watching, the one listening to the things that are not being said. the one memorizing the safe combinations and the server passwords, while the men are too busy congratulating themselves to notice. I reached into my pocket and touched the sonogram picture I had folded there. A new life, a clean slate. I was no longer the victim of a man who tried to erase me. I was the architect of my own resurrection. I had turned their arrogance into my armor and their secrets into my weapon. I looked directly into the lens of the camera, breaking the fourth wall, staring past the lights of Paris and into the eyes of everyone who has ever been underestimated. They think silence is weakness. They think that if you do not roar, you do not bite. But they are wrong. In a world full of people screaming to be heard, the person who can keep a secret is the only one who truly holds the power. I am Isabel. I am a mother. I am a survivor. And I am done pretending to be anything less than the storm that destroyed them. If you enjoyed watching the House of Cards fall and justice finally being served, do not forget to like and share this story. Tag a friend who needs to be reminded that the quietest people often have the loudest minds. Subscribe for more stories of retribution and reclaiming power. Because sometimes, the best revenge is simply living well and winning.